Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to episode 2 of our Summer Fabric webinar series, Teaching Your SaaS Systems to Listen to Each Other. Not sure if folks joined the previous one. We do have the recording up there, and we'll put the recording for this one up probably by tomorrow as well through there. Let's just start with a quick Teams meeting etiquette. It is a Teams webinar, so the participants are muted, but we do have the chat open. So if you've got questions as we're going through, feel free to ask those. I can try and have a look at those, or we've got Kevin and Logan and others moderating for us here. They can always jump in if there's an appropriate spot, because sometimes it's best to ask them as we're going through rather than waiting to the end. But when we do get to the end, we will open it up to Q&A there as well. I'm not sure the timing on this. This is actually very little depth. It's mainly going to be demo and discussions. We'll see how we go, whether we're closer to the 30-minute mark or the 45-minute mark. Last time I said I thought it would be more like 30 minutes, but I went right to the 45. I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Peter Carson. If you haven't attended one of my webinars before, welcome. I'm the president of Envision IT. We're a local Microsoft partner in the Toronto area, also 15 times Microsoft MVP and industry speaker. Contact details are up here. And fun fact, we're looking like we're finally locking down a date for a Toronto Microsoft 365 session early in the fall. So look for news on that shortly. Like I mentioned, agenda-wise, it really predominantly is a live walkthrough. I've got a couple of slides from last session's deck to sort of set the stage, and then we're just going to jump into it from there. So the concept is called Medallion Master Data Management. It's not my phrase. In fact, it's not even Microsoft's. Databricks was the one that first coined it. And this idea that every organization tends to have lots of different systems, and often data exists in those different systems for the same entities and same data points. And they're often not consistent. HR has one set of data, finance has another, sales has another, operations has another. And if you're like us and you're a for-profit organization, you have clients, that client data is going to be spread across all those different systems. We're not a big company, we're 24 people, but we still run a lot of different systems. We obviously leverage the Microsoft stack pretty heavily. Being a Microsoft partner, we get M365 and a bunch of resources from Microsoft as part of our partnership. But we made a decision a couple of years ago that we're actually going to go HubSpot from a CRM and marketing point of view, which I'm a big fan of. It's been really successful for us. We've run QuickBooks forever from a financial and accounting point of view. We have Teams. Obviously, we have to leverage our extranet user manager product as part of what we're doing here. We actually have a time tracking system that we built as a software development company 25 years ago. We still run it. It's been updated. It runs in the cloud now, and it's hosted on Azure SQL. It's very much part of our operations system, and SharePoint, obviously is where we keep all our documents and content related to the business that we do. So we've got all these different systems. They all have different pieces of the puzzle. Many of those pieces overlap. How do they get them consistent with each other? And it's this idea of a trusted gold record that we talked about in the previous session. So the idea is that, we've got these various different data sources on the left, whether it's CRM, ERP, your line of business, your HRIS, you can slot in your own systems to represent your organization. How do we get to a canonical master data for all those entities? If we take something as simple as a client, for even a not-for-profit has clients as well, where is that data mastered? Well, it may be mastered in a number of those different places. So as we're going through this Medallion architecture here, the idea is you start at the bronze level, and I'm going to show you in Fabric what this looks like, and you ingest the data from all the various different source systems, and you accept the fact that there's overlap between those systems. That's okay. What you're trying to do is just get all of the data into that bronze layer. Then you move into what's called the silver layer. And the idea here is, can we normalize, say, how we represent a client? A client has a name, has an address, has a phone number, has a domain, information like that. That may be represented differently in our case, in HubSpot versus QuickBooks versus our time tracking software. So how do we bring that together and have a standardized structure for that? We still have records for every system in there, but they're more easily comparable because we now have them to a normalized data structure. What we call the name of a client, that field is consistent, whether we're talking about the HubSpot data, the QuickBooks data, or our time tracking data. And then the last step is to bring it to a gold level, where we say, let's look at each of those source system records and figure out who is authoritative, not for the record as a whole, but for the individual pieces within it. Maybe the name of the customer, what we call them, we should consider that mastered in HubSpot. And QuickBooks should always be the same, and our time tracking software should always be the same. So how does that data flow through there? So that was really the topic for last week's webinar, was how do we get to that master data record? And this session is really, now that you've got that data, it's super important for the analytics and reporting side. On the right-hand side of that, thinking about Excel and Power BI as the obvious consumers for that. But as we head the AI age, maybe making a model content protocol like an MCP server out of that data that you can point your AI agent at it, and it has an authoritative, cleansed system of records, set of data through there. So there's interesting things you can do with that. But how can you also use it in your operational systems? How can you update various systems to say, if I'm not master for the name of a client, is my name correct? And if it's not, can it get fixed? How do we do those updates into the CRM systems, the ERP systems and such from there? And that's really what we're going to focus on here today. And the key is to say, well, we've got this normalized data in the silver layer from each of those systems, and we've got our gold master record. It's really a matter of comparing silver for each system against the gold record and saying, well, which fields are not mastered in this system and are different than the master record? Well, we need to go update those. And that's what we're going to be building out as part of this. But what I thought I'd do is start by just going through those systems. And for us, HubSpot is our system of record for a lot of the stuff in here. So things like company records, contact records, quotes, projects. We've got a lot of custom entities that we've built in HubSpot. And HubSpot makes it very easy to create those through the UI to say, hey, I need a new entity and it needs to have these properties on it, and we can build that in. Even the company record that we have open here, I've opened it up to our Contoso EOM demo that we're going to be using. I'm actually running in a HubSpot sandbox. What I've done is cleansed a subset of our live production data and brought it over into this sandbox environment here. So I'm not sort of releasing any private client information, but we've got some representative data in here. So if I go back to my company's list here, we've got a dozen or so companies loaded up in here. These are all AI generated made up names. So these are not real client names of ours from there. The Contoso one is the main one that we're going to focus on, that we've actually populated with more data. And it's one that we use from a demo perspective. So we've got information about a company. Where is the SharePoint site for this client? So each client, we spin up a SharePoint team site, a Microsoft 365 group for it. And that's the spot where we keep all of our documents and content related to the work we do with that client. We also spin up a team share channel as part of that. So we've got a Teams link here. We use OneNote a whole lot in the work that we do. And we use Azure DevOps for running our projects. So that link there links across to the Azure DevOps project in our client's DevOps workspace. So it's a nice way for us to tie all that together, and any member of our staff, wants to understand where's all the information for a particular client. It starts here in HubSpot. Now, I'll explain in a minute. You don't necessarily have to come to HubSpot to get all this, and that's the key of what we're looking to achieve through here. And then we have relationships. We've got a couple of projects that are being set up. So if I go into this demo project one, we can see properties for these. This is a custom entity that we defined in HubSpot, and it's got very specific fields in here, like what is its time. Splat is our time tracking software. What's the status in time tracking? Who's the PM on the project? What type of project is it? Is it non-billable? Is it per diem, et cetera? And what are some details around it from there? And there's also financial information in here. This is not filled in on the demo project because we don't have financials for that. I'm going to show you that on some other. But this information is not mastered here. It comes from other systems. So we're already starting to see, this system, HubSpot, is the master for certain things about projects, but other things come from elsewhere. This start and end date, number billed and hours and things like that comes from the time tracking software. So let's go over here for a second. And again, actually took a lot longer than I realized it was going to take me. I should have known to create sort of demo versions of all of our line of business systems. I didn't go as far as doing QuickBooks. I don't think QuickBooks has a sandbox environment, but HubSpot, we have a sandbox. Our time tracking software, we have our SharePoint, our Teams, our DevOps, all of that's been duplicated out. So this is effectively our time tracking software. So if I haven't tracked anything, or actually we cut it off at June 30th when we populated the data into here. But if I was to come to today and say, hey, I'm working on a webinar in here, it's not going to show up in here. I can put it under a regular Envision IT topic. But basically, this list of clients that we see here, the various different projects and tasks that we see here, all this information is needed for time tracking, but it actually comes from HubSpot. So again, data going back and forth. How do we make that all work? So the magic behind this and the topic for the webinar is Microsoft Fabric. And this is what's called a pipeline that does that process of moving that data through the various different layers. And we're going to go deeper into this, but I'm going to start at a fairly high level first. So the first thing is we need to go get the data from all the source systems. So HubSpot is a SaaS software. It has its own way of talking through APIs and such through there. We're going to talk in the next webinar series about Git integration and having dev, test, and prod environments. I learned a lot as I was building this out, a fair bit of pain around how to architect those sorts of things. My original pass at it, I was using what's called copy data objects, and I built a bunch of logic apps that would connect to HubSpot and read that data in. I quickly realized that as we move those from, say, a dev to a test to a production environment, there's a lot of work to move all those resources across, and there's a lot of configuration that gets messed up between those. And I ended up abandoning that approach. So I've kind of shied away from copy data objects and shied away from logic apps. It was just getting too complex. Notebooks are basically Python code that you can write to do whatever you need to do as part of the Fabric work. It became quite flexible. And I would say Microsoft Copilot became my best friend as well, because I'm not a Python developer. I learned a lot about how to do this through back and forth and back and forth and back and forth with Copilot. It's not a vibe coding tool that you just say, this is what I want, and boom, it does it, and it's done. There was a lot of iterations through there and a lot of corrections and mistakes and such from there, but absolutely super useful. I would encourage you to leverage AI if you're building things like that. But it basically reaches into HubSpot through the APIs, collects a bunch of data, and it puts that data into what's called a lakehouse. So if I come into here, I've got an EIT integration lakehouse. It has a bunch of tables and files. And those notebooks are basically just creating files in the lakehouse that later steps can consume to say, here's all the data that we care about for clients and partners and projects and associations, dump it into the lakehouse, and then the downstream step can make use of that. And we do the exact same model with our extranet user manager. It has an API. We can talk to that API through the notebook code, read the data that we want from there, and again, put that data here into groups and users that we're going to consume in our downstream steps as well. So that then brings us into this middle data flow. This is where most of the work is happening, and that's where it takes it through the bronze, silver, gold transformations. And at the end of that, it compares those gold records to the source systems and says, what do I actually need to go update in our time tracking software, and what do I need to write back into HubSpot because it doesn't have the right data in there? So let's start in this middle tier here. I can jump into that data flow and say, okay, let's understand the levels that we have and the data that we're pulling through. I'm not going to go into deep detail because that was the topic that we covered last webinar on how the bronze, silver, gold were built out. But basically, we've got HubSpot layers, we've got time tracking layer, we've got extranet user manager that are taking those JSON files and bringing them into the data flow here. And then the silver layer basically normalizes that and says, hey, I want to see clients from a HubSpot view and from a time tracking point of view with a consistent structure to them so I can start to compare them through there. That's our silver layer. And then our gold layer says, take that and pull that together. So if I look at projects, for example, the query has a bunch of steps through here. Data flows are quite nice for building these queries out. And you can pick and choose and say, hey, I want to start with maybe HubSpot as my master project record, but I want to merge in some time tracking data. I want to merge in some clients and partners data and build out this master record. And this is our gold record of projects that has a bunch of data that came from HubSpot, but it's also got financial data that came from our time tracking software, budget information, hours, start and end dates, things like that, all merged together into one master record. And that's our gold record. We've got that for clients, partners, projects, and users in here. Now we need to start pushing that back into other systems. And that's the focus here today, is to say, hey, I want to update things back into Azure AI Search. I'll show you where that comes up in a second. I want to push some of that data back into HubSpot, and I want to push it back into my time tracking software. So let's start with HubSpot for a second here. So there is data that's coming in from the time tracking software around when things were first started, when they finished. Actually, I ran the pipeline before. I should have staged some things up so we would have some differences through here. But basically what it's doing is it's saying, hey, get me the gold projects data and then merge in the silver projects from HubSpot. So what's the information that's in HubSpot, and expand that out. So we're going to see a bunch of duplicated columns. We're going to see columns from the gold record and columns from the HubSpot normalized data. So on the left are the gold records through here, and on the right side, all this silver projects HubSpot is the data that was coming in from HubSpot. And basically, we want to compare that and say what's different. So this function here, it's a little hard to see in that view here. Actually, this one's not a ton better. But basically what we're doing is we're saying, is the budget in the gold record different than what HubSpot has for budget? If it isn't, then this is a match. And keep going through. Look at the start date, the amount billed, the hours that we worked, the remaining budget, are we over budget? All of those financial metrics that we have in our time tracking software that we've calculated, and determine, is it different in HubSpot? Do I need to go update something through there? In fact, I can probably do a quick little change here. If I go into one of those existing projects, let's grab this first one here. And I go ahead and clear some of these fields out. It'll take a second to do some refresh from that. So I'll keep talking and then we'll come back to this one. So I've saved that record into HubSpot, and rather than running the entire pipeline, what I'm going to do is a little bit step by step. I just want to pull in the HubSpot data. So I'm going to go ahead and run that. I'll just leave it running in the background, and then we'll update our queries from there. But let's keep going through the steps that we've got here. So I'm basically trying to see which records don't match, which records do I need to update in HubSpot. And in a minute, we'll see one project coming in through there. We can filter that, and we can basically add in a bunch of columns to say, hey, these are the data set that I need to write back to HubSpot. And then if we come back to our main pipeline, we can see there's some notebooks at the end here. This one here says, go update the record into HubSpot. Actually, while we're waiting for that to run, let's just actually have a look at that code. So I think I showed this code briefly last webinar for doing the reading of the HubSpot data. And I've done a fair bit of work since then to standardize things and make it work across different environments. We're not going to see it all in there just yet. But this code block here at the beginning is something we see in all the different notebooks that I've got running there, and it's using this config notebook. And this is something that will become important when we get to multiple workspaces and working through development and production as part of that. So I come back into here and I look at my config notebook. This is basically a single spot that says, hey, what are all the things that I'm using? I'm using a lakehouse to store my data. This is where my HubSpot is. It has a token that we use to access it. You don't see the token here because we're actually storing it in an Azure Key Vault. We want to make things secure. So we never put things like secrets and access tokens into the code itself. We always put it into Key Vault. We do the same thing with our time tracking software. It's got a Key Vault to access the database, and our extranet user manager, same thing there. So these are all the details, but these are all specific to a particular environment. So I'm going to have a whole another section of code to say, hey, for production, use these values, use different key vaults, use different URLs, use different databases, but everything downstream leverages this, and the code doesn't change from environment to environment, which is really important if you're trying to build a proper dev test production type of environment through here. So it's building out this configuration. It's using it in here. We've got some standard functions in here, and it's basically reading in the HubSpot data and updating. So if I come back to my query here, let's just go ahead and refresh that. So it's going to read the new data from the lakehouse that my notebook generated. And if the demo gods align, I didn't actually dry run this. We actually should see one record show up in here. There we go. So this is saying, hey, that HubSpot object ID, this is the primary key. And it's really important, each system, you understand what your primary keys are for those systems. So if I look at this app dev project that I opened up in here, you kind of need to understand the HubSpot URLs, but this ID here is the unique identifier in HubSpot for this particular project. This is what's called the object type ID. That's our custom project type that we've created. And honestly, Copilot helped me a ton just figuring out how HubSpot organizes their data and how they structure as part of that. So you can see I cleared out the budget and the start date in there. And Fabric is now saying, hey, one of these things is wrong. We need to update it. And it's got the correct total budget and the correct start date in there. Start date looks weird. HubSpot wants what's called a Unix formatted date in there. Further back in the steps here, before we remove columns, you can see the more human-friendly start dates that we had in there. In any case, let's come back. I'm going to exit out of these notebooks here. Fun fact, we're running on the lowest Fabric capacity. If I try and run 2 notebook sessions at the same time, we'll run out of capacity and it becomes painful. So I have to make sure I close my notebooks, stop the sessions before I open another one through them. You could have a higher capacity, that would work fine. I don't want to spend the money. It's about $400 a month to run this. We could actually optimize that and have the service turn off and on only when we're using it and save a bunch more money through there. That's probably a later step that we're going to do. But I basically want to take this data and push it back into HubSpot. So how am I going to do that? Well, if I come back to this update HubSpot notebook here, I actually didn't think I was going to get this ready for demo because at about 10:20 today, I hadn't figured this out yet. We still had a different structure where I was using a logic app to push that data back into HubSpot. It still used a key vault and was calling patches in HubSpot to do that. I basically said to Copilot, hey, here's what I'm doing in a logic app. Here's the pattern that I'm using in a notebook in Fabric to read data. Can you build me a function that writes the data back? And it didn't get it right the first time. I had to do some tweaking and back and forth through that, but it did actually create me a first pass at this patch with retry function here that could call and say, hey, go load up that update projects HubSpot, that table of things that need to get pushed into HubSpot. And I need to set these fields back in HubSpot based on the data that came out of that table. So go call a patch to HubSpot to push the data in. And this is the API that HubSpot provides us to do those sorts of things. So if I go ahead and run this notebook, it'll go get its configuration first, which we want. That usually takes about 10 or 15 seconds or so to do that. Then it'll run the function definition, and then it'll actually execute the update from there. And once that's completed, if we go back to HubSpot, we should see that record updated from there. How are we doing there? It's still in progress. That succeeded. This should run pretty quickly, less than 1 second. I think this takes a few seconds to run. Progress. Done. Okay. So that didn't take too long. So let's go back to HubSpot. Let's refresh our record here. And the demo gods didn't align. We didn't actually see that come through. I suppose I should have done a dry run from that. But that should have taken the updated data that I pushed and pushed that back up in. Oh, you know what I didn't do is I didn't do a full run of this. I never pushed this data into the lakehouse, so we don't see any data there. I'll do a save and run here to actually do the full run. We won't pause and wait to see how that goes through there. So you can see, you can do step by step as you go through here. Sometimes you miss a step and things don't work properly. Probably safer just to rerun the whole pipeline through as part of that. I mean, if we look at the timing for this, I can view my run history here. So this is the dry run that I did just before the demo. Actually, it was literally just before the steps all succeeded through there. Now, when you're building a pipeline, you can define parallel steps in here. Like when I'm reading the data from HubSpot, I can concurrently also be reading the data from Extra User Manager, but those don't need to be serial steps. So I actually kick them off together. So when we're looking at the overall timing, I'd need to just take the longer of the two, which was the data at 3 minutes. But both of those things need to complete before that data flow in the middle can run. And it took 4.5 minutes. It's the longest step through that process. When it's done, we need to push those changes back to time tracking and back to HubSpot. The longer one there was the updating HubSpot, took about 3.5 minutes through there. So total time was 1 plus 5, about 6, 9, call it 9, 10 minutes to run this process all the way through there. The reality is when we run it in our production environment, we obviously have a lot more data there. It doesn't actually slow things down particularly from there. So that's sort of the timing that we have through there. It's not alive that every time you do a change, you can run this and seconds later you see the update in the other system from there. I actually started building things that way before I got into this whole Medallion architecture. And it was nice that things updated immediately, but it became this tangled spaghetti mess of workflows on the HubSpot side and logic apps all triggering each other. And it was just not supportable, not maintainable. We couldn't build it out into what we needed to do. So this architecture works much better from that point of view. Let's see if, no, that's still running. Oh, wait, no, it looks like it may be finished. Yep, that succeeded. Took about a minute. You do see some variability in the timing there too. So I'll go ahead and give this another run here. I actually just need to run the last step because the other ones have already run. Because that session's open, it should actually run a lot quicker. So it updated one record, which is what I expected to see there. And if I come back to my HubSpot, and I will give up if it didn't work this time. There we go. We've got our budget and our start date data back in there. So we're able to push that data back into HubSpot. And the same is happening in the other direction. If I was to change the status of this project, maybe to inactive, because I don't want people time tracking against it anymore, that change gets pushed through the update splat step back into our time tracking software, and that project would no longer be available for time tracking. Now, I've just got the two systems wired in through the demo stuff here. I did want to show you some of the other downstream pieces that we have in there. If we look at the data flow here, you'll see there's a third update section, which is AI search. We use this a lot in our Extranet User Manager product. I did want to be able to show it in the demo portal. I didn't get that piece running just yet. So I'm going to take us over to our live portal here for a second. And I've got a friendly client, Patty from MBA in Canada. She's participated in webinars before, so I can share their portal view. This is basically where our clients and staff would come to as sort of the launching off path for everything related to what we're doing with the client. And a bunch of those things that we saw up at the project or at the client level, if I go up one level through here, like the Azure DevOps and the Teams and the OneNote and SharePoint site, such from there, actually surface up through here. So these links here are all coming from the HubSpot data. They get pushed into Azure AI Search and surfaced up into our client portal. Our projects list comes through here. Things like start date and last activity will get populated in the future with the time tracking data that comes through there. I can drill down into individual projects into here and open up a data room. and see all the documents related to the, say, the ongoing support project through there. So there's a lot of integration between the different systems. We've got Azure DevOps, we've got Teams, we've got SharePoint, even Power BI reporting data of client reporting, all coming through what was entered through HubSpot, through our time tracking, through our Extranet User Manager product, all coming together in this consolidated view. So we're bringing this gold master record up here, and then we're pushing it back out into those different operational systems. And the details are going to be different for different organizations. We've got ongoing client projects going on around this, where in one case, we've got SAP and Salesforce and a third-party CAD engineering system that all have pieces of the puzzle here. And we're trying to bring a consolidated view down through there. We're just getting started on a proof of concept on that. We've got a large healthcare client where we've got patient information and Entra ID information and system information all coming together and pushing through from there. So this pattern and this model works really well, whether you're a small organization like us or you're a very large enterprise with tens of thousands of users and clients. The pattern holds and works well across that. So I'm going to just kind of wrap things up from there. We've got a couple of resources, but I do want to talk about the overall series that we're going to be going through. So this article here kind of explains the webinar series. So we've done the previous session, which was retrieving the data from the various SaaS systems into that master record. The session today here was more about pushing that data back into source systems. Let's not just use it for reporting purposes. Let's actually write back into target systems, whether you've built those as custom systems or they're off-the-shelf SaaS software. With a little bit of work, you can figure out how to write that data back in. The next session coming up, we just need to pick a date for the upcoming sessions, is to organize this all around Azure DevOps and Git. And it's a really important piece. I mean, a little teaser here, if I come back to my main Fabric workspace, lighting up this source control link and having it connected to a dev repo where I can track all my changes. These are all synced right now, so everything's up to date. Super valuable from a development point of view. As you start changing things, being able to go back to previous versions, having multiple people work on it, really important on the project. The session after that, we're going to look at Excel. So Excel is something most businesses use. Actually, in our environment, we use it as a data source for what we're talking about here. We actually do staff resourcing and scheduling in Excel, and it feeds into the same system as part of this. And then next from there is bringing that out into Power BI. Some talk around paginated reports and what we're doing with AI search to kind of address the fact that SQL Server reporting services is something that Microsoft hasn't given any love to a long time. And then I think we probably want to add another session in here, maybe before the end, maybe at the end, where we bring in the AI piece to that, because that's super important now as well. Can we create what's called an MCP model of this data, light up AI agents against that, use that as part of the solution that we're building out through there, as things that we want to talk about. But Kevin, let me turn it back to you. Not sure if we've got questions that we want to take from the group as a whole from here.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions for you that have filtered in. So somebody asked about like the SaaS applications and API changes. Because SaaS applications are constant flux. The APIs sometimes change. How much maintenance of the workflows are required for something like this?
That's actually a great question. So if we come back to our overall view here. So let's take HubSpot, for example. It's a commercial SaaS software, and yes, they could very well change their APIs. In fact, there's a number of different ways to authenticate to HubSpot. We're actually using what's called a legacy mode, and they're warning us saying, stop using this. We have a new modern approach. So we actually need to refactor some of our code to do that. But the key is to build sort of modules around this. And Copilot has been super handy for me to help build that out, to say, hey, can I create helper functions to talk to HubSpot? And once I've built this helper function once, right now I'm just updating Splat project data into HubSpot, but I may want to push other data into HubSpot. So this becomes a fairly maintainable piece that is isolated from changes that HubSpot does. If HubSpot says, hey, you need to call a different API endpoint here, I should probably abstract that one as well and not repeat it throughout in there to make it easy to absorb those changes. And same thing, Microsoft is changing things all the time. Do we go through SharePoint APIs or Graph APIs? Is there new Graph endpoints? Yes, there's absolutely changes all the time through there. But if you structure your code well, that you isolate those in helper functions in specific spots, it makes it much easier to adapt to those changes as vendors change their systems. And even your own systems. You have a new time tracking software that you've built as an organization, and that has API or database changes as part of it. That comes into that as well.
Another question came in, and I'm not sure if you addressed this, but it was about the timing of the data sync, like how real time or close to real time is the data sync?
Yeah. So, part of Fabric is you can actually set up a schedule for the pipeline itself. I haven't done that on ours here, but if I go back to the artifact, I can define a schedule in here and say, hey, I want this to run every night, or maybe I want to run it every hour. It's really up to you to decide what's an appropriate schedule for that. How important is that data to be current and up to date? Honestly, if our amount of time billed against a project is within 24 hours of current, that's acceptable to me. As people are time tracking through the day, sure, we could catch that up through the day, but is it really that relevant from there? Other systems, you may have more need for immediacy as part of that. So, obviously you have to look at how long it takes. This ran for about 10 minutes. So obviously you can't schedule it every 5 minutes. It's not going to be finished before it wants to run again. So decide between how long does the process take and how often do you need that data updated. You can also start to segment it and say, hey, there's a lot more pieces that we need to bring into our puzzle here. I focused just on a couple of data elements, and maybe you want to split that out into different pipelines. And some of them could be more frequent and some could be less frequent, depending on how the immediacy needs are for that data.
Got it. And I think the last one I had here was what kind of governance controls need to be in place before somebody kind of works on kind of pushing data out?
I think the important part is you got to be really careful before you start pushing data back into source systems. And honestly, when we first started building this, we were pushing data back into our live systems, which is a big no-no. We know better. You're supposed to have dev and at least dev in production, maybe test environment as well. So it's really important to have that. And it took a lot of work to get a sandbox set up in HubSpot. And honestly, HubSpot didn't do an awesome job. Like customizations of cards and views and a lot of things that we customized didn't come across when we snapshotted our production environment, and you have to recreate them. So I recreated some of them to get it going, but there's a lot of work involved in getting that together. But it's really valuable to say, hey, I can break things here and we can just refresh it again from production and try again. I haven't blown up our real systems as part of this. So you do need to be quite careful as you're going through that process. Obviously, having code reviews, I actually like using Copilot to do code reviews to say, hey, here's where we're at now. Is there tweaks, fixes, improvements that we should be doing as part of that? That becomes a part of the software development life cycle. And having all that in Git that you can track, particularly if you've got multiple people working on the project, hey, who's done what changes and are they all okay? You can review those before you push them into your production branch and make them live in prod. Super important as you get into bigger enterprise systems.
Excellent. Well, that's all we have for questions.
Very good. I think we're wrapped then. I managed to get us in 6 minutes under the 45 mark. So I want to thank everybody for joining. And next session, we'll get more into the source control and those different environments and how you manage that in your Fabric environments. So thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.